Howdy, all you delicious people. Today I am going out of my way to ultimately just really wanting to go out of my way to talk about a certain show. Ultimately, I had kind of skipped really going out of my way to really review Daredevil Season 1. I basically kind of rehashed and otherwise got out of my way to just talk about Season 1 and Season 2 of my Daredevil Season 2 review. Going and looking at that, I'm like, you know what? I never really quite gave the show enough justice because ultimately, Season 1 was a great show. Season 1 was a very intriguing show to me, and ultimately I thought, you know what? I think it's about time for me to really go into this show and review it. Because ultimately, it's just a real enjoyable show. And so when looking at it, I'm just like, you know what? I really want to do this, but I want to make it a big thing. I want to make it bigger than what it is. So how do I do that? Well, my first plan was maybe to do like a watch along, but I don't know. I don't like watch alongs. It's a lot of just dead air, or it's a lot of just time to have just silence to wait for people to talk in the show. And then ultimately, like, would people really want to watch a watch along? And then on top of that, looking at it all full and well, what if the channel gets monetized, and eventually watch-alongs would be very difficult with ads randomly placed throughout episodes and this and that through watch-alongs. So I came to the conclusion of a couple things. Ultimately, I want to give every episode of Season 1 justice because how thoroughly I enjoyed it. So I thought, why not individually review Daredevil Season 1. Episode to episode, microscopically dip diving through and ultimately reviewing what I felt about each episode. So eventually it'll be like a watch along instead of or it being like, hey, I'm going to watch episode 1 today. Hey, I'm going to watch episode 2. Hey, I'm going to watch episode 3, and so on and so forth until Season 1 is done. Ultimately, if people enjoy this way of doing things, maybe I will continue into Season 2 and just have this just be a episode review, and then ultimately I can let everybody know, hey, if you want to hear my original thoughts on Daredevil Season 2, there's a whole review, I believe, still up about that. So, let's review Episode 1, Season 1 of Daredevil. So, I'm going to talk about this show in a very cryptic-like sense, give you a double 5 time count, and then break down into spoilers about this show within the first episode. Ultimately, here's my thing. I did not, in a very cryptic-like sense, I did not realize how many times that they have to conveniently continue to, like, make people forget that Matt Murdock is blind on this show. How it seems like there seems to be kind of like jokes going on about him consistently being blind. I don't know if that's like an intentional thing because ultimately they gotta have humor on the show. I don't know, but ultimately, really, this episode is really to bring up, of course, Matt's origin and really very much kind of like some snippets here and there of his father. Before Matt really and truly became the vigilante that he is known to eventually be. Ultimately, within this episode, like, I remember, like, my very first reaction to this show while watching the first episode, and I'm like, man, like, is this just gonna be like a entire like cop drama? Like, I was assuming that this entire show was not going to have any action whatsoever, and it wasn't gonna come off as a superhero show, because ultimately I was naturally assuming within this show that we wouldn't have any action. It would just be like Matt Murdock just being 100% lawyer, or at least 90% lawyer, and then a little bit of action sprinkled here and there. And I was immediately assuming that's how this show would go. But no, reasonably, even with this within this first episode, we get action, somewhat, because a lot of this first episode is putting pieces on the chessboard. It's ultimately letting people know who certain people are via uh, Matt's father, ultimately who the villain might be at the very end of this episode. We get to set up Foggy and Matt starting out their business. We ultimately, on the very first pilot episode, we get to very much get to know this character called Paige that will be a cementing character throughout this entire season, if not more so, especially in the third season. Like, man, is she like overwhelmingly used in the third season. But again, I digress, because ultimately we're here for season one. Going into going into this episode, I loved how there's so much mystery. Like, if anything, you get like little like snippets about things here and there, but I loved the mystery of every little thing that goes on here. It's like they just kind of just give you enough in the episode to get you intrigued about what is to be on to the next episode. I think, especially in this very first pilot episode, this is the best thing that they do, is leave everything in a cloud of mystery, to where it's like, okay, you get to know about Matt's father, but not quite. You get to know little bit about Matt, but again, just kind of not quite. And you get to kind of see the big picture, or you get to kind of see the big picture of like these guys fledglingly just trying to desperately get one case under their belt, and ultimately you get to see Matt and Foggy ultimately having these conundrums of, especially with Foggy, how basically he is like, God, I just want a case to get me money, and how really he's complaining about how he's going to be able to afford any number of things, just because it doesn't seem like they're ever going to get a legitimate case that would pay them legitimate money. Which is very interesting. How basically, like, Foggy is realistically the character that is kind of the very opposite of Matt. And even in the first pilot episode, we get to know that. We get to notice that ultimately Foggy very much uh, is Matt's yin yang like motion, because ultimately Matt is just like, he doesn't give a crap. He just cares about the innocent, or he cares about the proper case, and ultimately he's just gonna lie in wait until that case happens. Where Foggy is just like, I think for him, he just wants a billion cases under his belt. You would have thought that at some point that for them, that they would have ultimately just, like, Foggy would have just said, you know what, I'm going to do my own cases and you're going to do your cases. And, like, it is what it is. Because Foggy, I think, eventually it gets to the point where he does do that, but reasonably it's just like, okay, why is it that both of them have to be together, even though of course you can understand why also. It was kind of funny where, like, basically Foggy desperately at some points wants to be Matt. Like reasonably, there's a lot of times uh, where Foggy, especially even in this episode, where he's just like, God, how is it that like beautiful women just fall into your lap? And like, and how is it that like being blind works so well for you? And this and that. It's like, God, I wish like I'm gonna start wanting to work on my blind thing going on. Like I'm gonna try to get blind. So and we're like, what? It's like, Foggy, come on. Like I'm sure you can. Like I'm sure eventually you're gonna like have something work out for you, and this and that. But it's kind of hilarious to like see Foggy, even though he doesn't want to be mad. Again, on the opposite end, he desperately like he doesn't want to be Matt because of his morality, but he wants to be Matt because like he gets the ladies and basically he is like a chick magnet, and also that like everything goes well for him with him being blind to the point of even cases work out well because again blind. um so really Foggy is in a sea of jealousy a lot of the times, even though realistically Foggy could leave any time to get a better set of cases or a better set of employment, or just not having to have a cold hard sneeze away from not being able to afford certain things here and there. So, going into this episode, I think it's about that time to go into spoiler territory. If ultimately, like there was some like this episode very much becomes like a very much crime trauma or crime drama with a little bit of action um, spilled in spilled in. Ultimately, of course, when looking at this, the biggest gripe that I have is we have we have Black Suit Matt within this show. Ultimately, I'm assuming, yeah, we would have to have a very ninja style Matt. We would have to have him be a like he has to earn his eventual costume. But again, like my biggest gripe is just that like it seems like through all of these shows, like we had to earn their costume, or in a lot of ways, there's some characters that never really truly really received a costume. Like Luke Cage, ultimately, like his costume is just a hoodie with bullet holes, and that's pretty much his costume. Iron Fist, like basically, is just street clothes. Like basically, he never really and truly receives a his Iron Fist uniform, or if he even does get it, it's just kind of teased and like, ha ha ha, but we're never going to really pull that trigger. And so with Daredevil, like, I was thinking, I'm like, oh my God, is it going to be like multiple seasons and we're never going to see. We're never gonna see the Daredevil like actual costume, but if you guys know season one, you'll know how this goes. Yeah. So let's go into the double five time of this episode. Ultimately, again, if you guys enjoy the pilot review and ultimately want me to kind of comb through and ultimately go through more of these episodes, I will do so because ultimately I enjoy this show. And like really, it's kind of interesting looking back on the show from the very early seasons when it was actually really and truly great. Especially season one and two were really great for me. And so ultimately, I'm kind of thinking about going back into early Arrow as well, like the very first early seasons, and reviewing those because ultimately I really thoroughly enjoyed Arrow up until a point where it started to doing start to do like 80 bajillion crossovers, and that's when I fell off the wagon because I just stopped caring about that show, to be brutally honest. So, spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this show. Luckily for me, I wouldn't say ruin this show because there's nothing bad about it up until a certain point of hill to die on. So, episode 1. So we have it to where we have a kind of showcasing of all the scenery pieces, but then also getting into Matt's origin via this story. We ultimately have Matt that had kind of pushed an old man out of the way to uh, get mixed into a car accident, which was mixed in with a bunch of barrels of toxic waste that ultimately gets into his eye. We immediately at some point see his father rushing to him to ultimately say, "Hey, Matt, don't open your eyes." Um, and there is just a litany of just toxic waste all around, and we have an old man screaming like, "Your boy saved me." And so ultimately we're led to the conclusion, because ultimately it's not shown on screen, that Matt had paid the price for saving somebody by losing his sight. Ultimately, him yelling out continuously, "I can't see, I can't see," ultimately leading us to kind of really telling us that Matt, of course, is blind. If there isn't consistent bizarrish jokes that I don't quite understand through plotting of this show, like I kind of realized that maybe, I guess that is the good thing about Matt, is because Matt maybe likes or maybe wants those kind of jokes, because reasonably, if people don't realize, or if people don't notice him, then I think that might be all for the better for him, because ultimately, if he's not noticed, that he can kind of easily slip between the cracks and ultimately um, be a better vigilante, because nobody really truly notices him as Matt, as Murdoch. Going into this, we very much have a setup of Matt and Foggy getting their first building together, their very first law building together. Ultimately, Foggy is just like, well, hopefully we're gonna get some cases brewing right away, because ultimately I don't know how we're gonna be able to afford this building. Although, well, eventually, this woman who is kind of eventually just like talking about the entire room and this and that, ultimately uh, mentioning, it's like, well, I'm sure you're gonna love all the views, and Matt's like, yeah, I don't think that's gonna work out for me. So ultimately, we have Matt that is letting the girl know, okay, can you kind of walk me through the room, because I'm like, oh, this is awesome, like freaking how these people are taking the time to write Matt as like so cleverly woven to like you get the crappy jokes, but then you also get the time where Matt is going to ask this woman to walk him around the room so he can assess where everything is. And I think that that's a just kind of masterful pieces that are kind of like, we don't really realize how difficult of a life that Matt has, and to consistently have times where Foggy has to help Matt understand this, or understand like what he can't see, and there's consistent times where we are consistently having to help Matt, which adds great things to the story because it makes for an overall just a different approach altogether to a story. Because how very rarely do we ever get a main character who uh, needs cues, he needs help understanding like the portions of story and this and that to um, help him carry on figuring things out. Once we eventually like, I want to quickly mention this because I want to kind of get the father stuff out of the way. I want to get Matt's father stuff out of the way within this first episode. So reasonably, we get to know a little bit, a tiny bit about Matt's father, and basically he's telling him, kind of like in the original Ben Affleck movie, it's like, hey, you don't hit people, you just hit books, and basically like Matt's father is telling him, it's like, hey, like don't end up like me. Uh, and ultimately he is wanting his son to have a really great education and this and that because ultimately uh, Matt's father didn't he just kind of bashed himself against the head quite frequently, or in metaphorical terms, fought a lot of people and didn't give up. So ultimately, where Matt's father would basically fight people like the devil because he wouldn't give up. Ultimately, every single time that Matt goes into a scenario where he thinks he might get beaten, or where he's exhausted, or where he is reasonably going to just go, I think this might be it for me. Again, every single time his father in his mind is telling him to not give up, to get back up, to dust yourself off and fight again. And that is the amazing thing about this story, is it's bringing back some little thing that Matt's father had said to reiterate it when eventually we finally get to Matt having to be in a fight scenario where he ultimately is exhausted and he is challenged. So we go into this, and Matt goes into a confessional because ultimately leading up to that fighting portion, and then we're going to go like a roundabout way for all these other things. We ultimately have Matt going into confessional again, talking about his father, talking about his father fought people like the devil, and he ultimately mentions his record. He ultimately mentions uh, some fights and stuff like that. He ultimately like brings up everything about his father to this priest, leading up to every single time that Matt is going to become the Daredevil, or in this point in time, the ninja. Ultimately, every single time he goes and puts this costume on, he immediately thinks of his father. Because in his confessional, he is asking the father for forgiveness for a crime that he has not yet committed. And of course, the priest says, well, that's not how confession works. And it's like, well, it's like, well, hey, like, I want to take some people down, and like, I guess I'll have to confess later on, and I'll have to come back. With Matt being a very devoted Catholic, like religious person, ultimately, that is much more shown in season 3. But in season 1, we are very much kind of we almost kind of forget about the whole Catholic religion, actually, like things at a lot of points, and reasonably, it's kind of nice to see this time really taking place in the very first pilot episode. So we kind of getting to the transition now of kind of going into the other episode and part of the story. We now have Matt and Foggy that are just desperate to hope that they can try and get some kind of case somehow. And Foggy seems to usually have intel on a lot of the people that are kind of coming through the police department, because ultimately he is kind of bribing a police officer, so ultimately they can kind of get some decent cases. So Foggy and Matt appear into an interrogation room, and they meet a girl named Paige. Ultimately, of course, Foggy is asking if they could help her, and she just kind of shrugs. And Foggy, of course, has to point out to Matt that she shrugged because, of course, he can't tell. Which is again a great thing that we're like trying to rope this in, that it's not like every little thing that somebody does is important, and Matt should know about it. Even if it's something as little as, hey, they farted. No, I mean, okay. Or this and that. It's really like, it would probably be something that somebody would probably quickly forget, but instead, like, Foggy mentions him, oh, she nodded, or hey, she shrugged, or hey, like, she doesn't care, or she gave me the finger, or whatever. Because ultimately, since Matt can't see this, ultimately he doesn't know what's going on. But ultimately, I'm sure in a lot of ways he probably could, if reasonably he did a certain thing that eventually we'll see somewhere down the road in the show. So Karen walks us through what had happened to her. Ultimately, uh, she had gotten through some information through her business. Ultimately, she had thought it was some kind of embezzlement scheme, and like she was probably not going to think anything of it. But ultimately, she started asking the wrong questions to the wrong people, ultimately having one of her coworkers just kind of come and have a drink with her, and that led her to eventually waking up uh, out of nowhere into her apartment with blood on her hands. Ultimately, we have it to where Matt is hearing this entire thing, and ultimately there are plenty of times where Matt is listening to the heartbeat of this woman, and every single time he talks to her, he is trying to see how innocent she is, to the point where eventually to where Karen is being put into Matt's apartment, and he gives her a shirt to wear, because ultimately she had all her clothes that she only has left with her are all wet, of course. Ultimately, he of course gives her clothing and stuff like that. Talks about the apartment and how like ridiculously cheap it was, and like, and everybody was kind of upset that how like cheap he got this apartment. But reasonably, of course, there was a giant billboard with a very bright sign outside, which ultimately led us to uh, make it so that a blind man would easily want this apartment much more so than anybody else. So going into this much more so, we eventually Ari is having Foggy just kind of plead down the case. And Matt is just like, no, she's innocent. Don't do this. Don't plead down the case. Like, we're gonna fight this. And Foggy's like, are you kidding me right now? Like, dude, we can kind of just get a downgraded sentence and whatever. Like, if anything, like, who was the killer? How are we gonna fight this? Where's the smoking gun and this and that? And so immediately we have to jump into a different segment to kind of eventually head towards where this eventually is heading. So, the big action sequence that ends up at the very end of all this. So, we ultimately lead to us noticing this character called Wesley. Wesley is Kingpin's second in command. Like, basically, there's kind of like some unspoken relationship between Kingpin and Wesley, but like we always can see that Wesley is like his right hand man, um, and this and that. He basically, Wesley, a lot of times when Kingpin's not there, Wesley's the face of this company. So ultimately, in the very beginning of this, we have Wesley who is squeezing some guy and ultimately telling him, hey, I have a video of your daughter and this is a live feed, and look at this guy who's going to wave at you and call your daughter and make sure that this is a live feed. We're watching over your daughter, so if anything, do whatever we say. Eventually it gets down to the point to where eventually we have Wesley eventually going through all of the big heads of this town, all the drug aficionados, or all the characters that ultimately have some kind of either drug or some kind of thing going through the system, or just gangs or stuff like that. Eventually, Wesley is trying to get a report from all these heads of all these gangs. Ultimately, there's one character that seems to keep popping up. That is a lawyer that usually consistently cooks their books a lot of the times, and at some point will be a guy that holds a lot of the money. Ultimately, we find out in one of the portions of the of one of the gangs, Wesley finds out that it seems like there's a guy that is throwing a wrench in all their business. Some ninja guy with a black suit, aka Daredevil, aka Matt. But they don't, of course, know that, because why would they this soon? So ultimately, Wesley is pointing to them. It's like, take care of your business. It's like, get rid of this guy. Like, if he can't be bought, then freaking kill him or something, and just kind of take care of it. Like, do your job. And so ultimately they're like I think the Russian gang is looking at Wesley and is just like, well, hey, how about we, like, considering this guy is just kind of popping everybody off in town, how about we start working with this guy, and we pay him off or do whatever, like, we start working with him. And Wesley's like, no, you don't need to go that far. Like, if anything, this is going to be under control very soon. So, ultimately leading us to now, the big huzzah of this real episode, and ultimately there's probably something here and there that I'm probably forgetting to mention, or there's something here and there that, admittedly, I should have probably mentioned, but I probably forgot about. But going into this very end of this episode, we find out that Karen seems to have some information that she doesn't want it leaked out, because ultimately she doesn't think anyone's safe. She can't trust anybody, or ultimately she can't trust anybody, or who she thinks that she can trust, she's very leery about, because she's like, well, hey, if you're with me and you trust me, you're probably going to end up dead. And because ultimately the friend that she had went to confide into about what had going on, she had been waking up to his dead body. So reasonably, she ultimately has information. She has this. Uh, she has this tape of sorts, or this kind of just evidence to not only clear her, but to have some dirt on some folks, some information. Um, uh, yeah, she just has like some evidence. Let's call it evidence, to kind of make it easy. So we ultimately have it to where eventually she can't rely on Matt, but eventually she eventually gives this evidence to Daredevil. Ultimately, he finds his way to get rid of these goons to protect Karen, and then eventually he asks her for the evidence that she has, and she's like, well, yeah, but like you can't trust anybody with this evidence. He's like, well, if we can't trust anyone, then let's just make it as widely public as possible, so it's like undeniable that if we can't trust anyone, we're just going to get it out there somehow through the press or anything like that, to where they have to acknowledge this and there's no denying. So they eventually release this information out, this evidence out, and so reasonably thereafter that we have Wesley that is kind of um, in his car, kind of like kind of knowing, okay, well, Karen's clear, and he's kind of like counting all the things that um, is kind of tied to this case. Ultimately, all the while talking to the Kingpin, the Fisk, and so ultimately, the Kingpin is talking to Wesley and just kind of going over like business as usual, going, okay, well, this didn't go our way, but hey, like, can we get to this Karen girl? And ultimately, can we, like, who are these lawyers that she was with? And ultimately, Wesley mentions, okay, well, she was with, uh, the Matt and Foggy characters, and ultimately Fisk is like, well, how about we like put a report on them? Like ultimately we might use them sometime later, and ultimately it's just kind of like, okay, um, since this didn't go our way, maybe we can twist and turn these people to eventually get back onto our side. And like, because that's always what Fisk is. He's like, well, like if we lost this battle, then we'll win the war. That's ultimately Kingpin's ultimate battle, is his battle of chess moves. Because if anything, he wanted to become the overall king of crime, but like he didn't want to control it. He just wanted to, or he didn't want to just be the best or biggest and whatever. He just wanted to control it all, so that way he could uh, do any number of things. He could eventually run it in the ground, or ultimately he could just kind of get rid of some people, some unsavory characters, if at any point they got in his way. So yeah, a little bit of the Fisk, a little bit of the action of Daredevil ultimately eventually will be leading into much vicious characters going up against Matt, and ultimately we'll have bigger cases and stuff like that. Um, I apologize if I got a little mixed up about that evidence thing. I was like, what was the it was evidence, and I was like, okay, I was like so confused. Um, but yeah, so ultimately, yeah, that's my review of the first episode of Daredevil. I don't know how long the episode was compared to my review, but if anything, yeah, kind of a very origin heavy episode. I'm hoping in the next episodes after that, from whatever I can remember. Can't wait to the to the one episode where it's like one severely long shot of just like Daredevil just beating the crap out of people. And so ultimately, I'm waiting for when we get down to that point, and I will be reviewing that episode again. Um, but yeah, other than that, great episode. But I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.